It is September and I want to share my top 5 favourite plants of the month with you. We're nearing kind of the second half of the summer growing season. Things are going to start easing off a little bit. Now in Ireland we have had one of the wettest, coldest summers that we have ever had, I believe. And obviously that does affect the indoor conditions to some extent. Now, despite that, my plants are pretty happy and have grown very well this summer, which I'm really pleased about, but I know that that is going to start dropping off sometime soon. As things get colder, the days get shorter, all of that is going to affect the growth in some capacity. If you're new to these videos, the format is generally picking my top 5 favorites, telling you why they're my favorites, giving you some growth updates, and also a bit of a background about each species or hybrid or cultivar or whatever it is that I'm speaking about. Just so you can get to know these plants from the wild as well and get to thinking about where they're from. So the first up is my beautiful, wonderful, delicious Philodendron pedatum. Now, this plant has featured quite a bit in recent videos. The houseplant tour, of course, where, well, pretty much all of the plants are shown in the houseplant tour. But it is a really big feature in this room now. This plant has grown so much in the last year. I think what happened was I decided to give it a much bigger pot than it was used to, which resulted in it having kind of a more frequent access to water because of the extra substrate, and this kind of exploded in growth. I also did not prune it for most of this year at all. I just let it grow upwards and it was really happy. The leaves were getting much, much bigger, the biggest leaves I've ever had on this plant. And on top of that, I also gave it this huge big wooden stake to really give it a lot of support, and it has already grown to the top of that. I have cut off the top growth just to try and slow it down a little bit, but it's already actively growing. A huge update for this plant is that it has actually just flowered for me, which is the first time it has ever flowered. This is my second philodendron to ever flower in my collection. It's not something I ever really expected to happen indoors with my bigger philodendron, but yeah, quite surprising. I think that it indicates that it's obviously, its conditions are mimicking its natural habitat to a certain extent that it feels comfortable enough to flower. I believe that's how I think about it. I'm not quite sure if that is true or not. Often flowering in some plants, in particular Hoyas and things like that, can actually be an indicator of maybe some stress. So it's not always, you're not always able to figure out why exactly this happens. The first philodendron to flower for me was my Philodendron Plamanii, which is not a big specimen plant whatsoever, but it has flowered twice for me. And yeah, this is the first plant that was actually the first plant in this room as well to flower, first philodendron in this room to flower. I only get one flower at a time, so I can't really do anything with them, nor is that really in my plant care style. I feel like I just allow things to flower and that's fine. If I may come across certain two of the same genera that are flowering together, maybe I would attempt something, but that never really lines up for me. It is quite a fascinating process to see these plants kind of, I guess, just being themselves, acting out their growing habit. So that's really exciting. This plant gets a lot of extra floral nectaries. In particular, I've noticed as it's gotten bigger and taller, in the kind of newest maybe 2 or 3 leaves from that point onward, there's a lot of extra floral nectaries. They're all along, actually they're on the flower itself, they are on the petioles, some of it is on the back of the leaves. If you don't know what extra floral nectaries are, I do have a full video about that in my plant basics series, which I will link down below if you're interested. But it's kind of like this gooey, sticky substance, and it has an interesting relationship with insects in the wild, and that's why this happens. but it may be a protection mechanism, I'm not too sure. I do notice that it does tend to happen more if it's kind of adequately watered. Now, not to confuse this with gudation, which is water droplets on the tip of leaves, and these are not kind of sticky or sweet or anything. But yeah, I'm not sure if that's an additional sign of maturity either. But that happens on a lot of my philodendron as well. I'm not too sure. Now, this plant was first published in 1841, which was quite some time ago. Its native range is essentially South Tropical America, and countries listed in the native range are Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, French Guiana, Suriname, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and Venezuela. So it's all from that side of the world. It is a climber and it is native to a wet tropical biome, which a lot of the plants in this room are. So it's pretty happy, I think, with how things are going. A really beautiful plant. Pedatum, I believe either the word itself or it is kind of also known as the oak leaf philodendron. I think that's because of the shape of the leaves. Particularly if you look at mature leaves of this plant from the wild pictures of that, you'll notice that the leaves get even bigger and these kind of patterns are even more pronounced. If I can find a photo of that, I'll insert it here so you can see. I'm not quite sure about the future of this plant. As I noted, it is already at the top of that stake, which is not too far off the ceiling of this room as well, so I don't really know how I'm going to deal with that. I don't know, like a lot of my plants that are reaching the ceiling in this room, I'm just kind of letting it happen and we'll just see what happens. But it is likely that in the future this will just have to be cut back down again. I mean, that's the reality of growing big plants like this in an indoor environment. You run out of space, especially upward space, that it really wants to grow up on. So that's unfortunate, but yeah, a clear favorite of mine. I'm just in awe of it every day, and particularly in flowering now, it's really caught my eye. Next up is Anthurium crystallinum. Now I have two of these in my big tank terrarium downstairs, which I've just done a 2-month update video on. So I have the actual Anthurium crystallinum and then the silver bush cultivar of the crystallinum as well, and both of these are growing really well in that terrarium. Spoiler, if you haven't watched that video, it's gone really well and the plants are really happy, which is why this is on the top of my list. So I've had some new growth on both of these plants and they're really just so breathtaking. And I wish that Anthurium for me went a little bit more successfully outside of a terrarium environment, but I've never grown them so successfully as the ones that are in that terrarium at the moment. They're really happy there. It is warm, it has high humidity, good lighting, and I have a fan in there as well. But I mean, it has a lot of the elements of what a lot of us love out of these kinds of tropical houseplants that we grow. It has heart-shaped leaves, it has a velvety, thick texture, it has deep, beautiful veination, and the crystallinum itself in particular, I do think I prefer the look of that one more than the silver bush. The silver bush has more kind of a lighter colour, and the veination is kind of wider and takes up more of the leaf. But I love that dark, deep green colour of the crystallinum itself. It is truly so beautiful. This plant was first published in 1873 and its native range is from Panama to Colombia. It is an epiphyte, it's known as a sub-shrub, and it lives in a wet tropical biome, which is the same as philodendron, but a little bit more. I find these plants to be a little bit more specific, like with accepting kind of differing growing conditions, which is why they're happier in the terrarium environment. It's described as an epiphytic subshrub, which I find quite interesting. Subshrub, yes, that makes sense with its growing pattern, but to say it's epiphytic, I do find quite interesting because it's not something we always see a lot when you're growing Anthurium indoors, but that's what they like to do in the wild. So I wonder if I can think, as this plant grows bigger and will outgrow the terrarium itself, as it has almost already done, I like to think a lot more about how to provide structural support to these plants to see how they would like that. But yeah. The next plant, on researching for this video, I've realized that the actual species name that it's given and what I have said myself in the past is actually not 100% correct and is slightly different from the accepted species name. In any video where I look up accepted species names and I'm getting this information about when they were first published or what the native range is, I always get that from Plants of the World Online, which is a fantastic resource and basically has all of the species that are scientifically accepted. So that's where I get that information. So this is my Rhaphidophora and what I thought was Foraminifera, which it is called in almost all the plant shops and everything. But it's actually Foraminifera. Foraminifera. So just the difference in spelling and slight pronunciation there. So this plant in my recent restyle video and in my houseplant tour you would have seen kind of has a new place in my setup, which is always a great way to start noticing some plants that you maybe didn't notice before. In its previous location, it was on a shelf here and it was kind of blocked by everything. It wasn't kind of very visible to me a lot of the time, and a lot of the time it kind of grew out of control and then I had to cut it back because I didn't even realize what was going on. But now it has a different location. It's actually right here on the floor and it's getting some nice light. And I do think that it shows off the beautiful shape of the leaves here a lot better and it's kind of more in the forefront. So always a great way to kind of re-notice your plants is to move them. So when I first got this plant, it kind of appears to be, I guess, maybe a more boring look of a plant, like when you compare it with a crystallinum or something like that. It just has a plain green leaf with some venation, but actually it's grown to be one of my favorites and that's why it's in this video, of course. I just love the very subtle texture of the leaf. I love the shape of it, and it also has gotten some fenestrations as well, which has just added massively to its beauty, of course. And yeah, now unfortunately with this plant I do find that it gets to a certain stage and it starts to get a bit leggy, which to be honest has been my experience with almost all of my Rhaphidophora that I've grown, with maybe the exception of the Tetrasperma. The Tetrasperma will grow, for me at least, more similar to a philodendron in that it will just continue growing upwards, but it will still put out new leaves at every node, etc, etc. However, my Rhaphidophora decursiva and this Foraminifera, they kind of get to a stage where they start looking for structural support, but they will set out a big long stem with no leaves on it and it will get really leggy, or it will send out a type, almost a runner type of plant material that isn't the nicest to look at and doesn't, it's not my favorite type of growth habit. Now obviously this does have a small branch on it. I think it needs something more permanent that maybe will encourage it to keep with the bigger leaves and not need to search as much for something like that to support itself. This plant was first published in 1908 and its native range is from Borneo, Sumatra and Malaysia. It lives in a wet tropical biome like most of our plants and is an epiphyte and a climber, so it likes to climb on other plants. The next plant is a relatively new one, and actually one that straight after this video I'm going to be filming a repotting, and it's going to get a brand new pot, which I'm really excited about because it's in this really tiny little pot that I got it in quite recently. This is Hoya Mathilde. Now Hoya Mathilde is not a species on its own, it's actually a hybrid between two Hoya species. These are Hoya carnosa, which we know and love, and I have the Hoya carnosa here, and Hoya serpens, which I don't have in my collection. So it's a cross between these two species. And that kind of makes sense when you look at it, at least from the carnosa side of things. Its leaves are quite thick and very succulent, you know, they're not very thin. It's a good sturdy plant material. But it also has this beautiful kind of blue-grey speckled pattern on the leaves that is really, really gorgeous. And I feel like This plant is going to be one that will take off for me once it gets into a good, nice pot. It will be really, really happy. I just have that feeling. It's been really easy to care for so far. Despite it being in a really tiny pot and drying out way too much, it has been quite accepting of that from me. I will attach a photo here of what the flowers are meant to look like. It has not flowered for me, but it is a very recent addition to my collection. So to go through the two species that it is a hybrid of, Hoya carnosa was first published in 1810. It is native to South China, Laos, Japan and Taiwan. And it's a climbing epiphyte or lithophyte. And I hope that if you guys have watched my plant basics series on all of the phytes, that you have a kind of a background understanding of what these mean now. Pause for that if you can find it in your brain from that video. If you haven't watched this video, please do watch it. I will put it in the description of this video. But an epiphyte is a plant that grows on other plants, and a lithophyte is a plant that grows on rocks. So it can grow on either. And its habitat is really a subtropical biome, so slightly different to a wet tropical biome, but not too far off, but it is in a very different part of the world than the other plants that have been mentioned in this video. Hoya serpens then was first published in 1883. It is native to Central and East Himalaya, the Andaman Islands, and it is a climber and lives in a wet tropical biome. So, you know, a mix between these two, I think it will do quite well in this room, as has already really been shown by how it's growing. But that is the type of habitat that a lot of these plants in here come from and do well in. So I'm pretty pleased about that one. The next plant has definitely been shown in a favorites before. So I hope that doesn't bore you, but like I'm keeping true to what I'm feeling for this month. This plant has kind of shot out in growth, and I'm considering repotting it today as well because of that. But it's truly so beautiful and so easy to care for. So it's actually an unidentified begonia species that I have. I got this plant as a cutting, like a 1 or 2 leaf, very sad, should have died type of cutting in I think it was a Secret Santa or something. So from somebody I didn't know. At the time they did tell me what it was, but that has been so lost in translation. I have no idea where those messages are, or if it was in a note in the package, I'm not too sure. But I never wrote it down, and therefore I just don't know. However, it is a cane type begonia, and it is, like, I'm pretty sure it's a cultivar of Begonia maculata of some kind. So it's quite similar, but it has way more spots, and the spots are really, really silver, and it's just, it really catches your eye when you're looking at all of the green that is in this room, and it's why it always pops up for me as one that I really notice. Begonia maculata was first published in 1820. Its native range is in Brazil, specifically Rio. It is kind of a shrub, but can grow to a tree, which would be kind of amazing. But a lot of these cane type begonias can get to that stage if you let them and if you grow for them successfully. And it is native to a wet tropical biome. So maybe it would be a good idea to do a bit of a short video on maybe the plant basics series on biomes, what they mean when we say a biome, and what kind of the most common ones for houseplants are. Let me know if you'd be interested in that, because it is something that comes up a lot, but it may not always translate as to what that really means when you're caring for something. Those are my favorites for September. So as growth starts to kind of slow down after this point, you know, really be mindful of your plants and this change, this type of year. Of course, a lot of the people that watch my videos are not from this side of the world, so you will have different seasons, but always know that when a season changes, whether you're going into summer now while I'm going into winter or whatever it is, a change in season is always kind of a sensitive time for your plants, even while indoors, because your indoor environment is going to change with that, whether it's you're putting on your heating, whether you're turning it off, etc., etc., light levels changing from windows, all of that. Just be very mindful and careful with your plant care to not kind of overstress them in this transitional period. Let me know what some of your favorites for the month of September are. What is growing really successfully in your collection? Who are you loving this month? Because I know it goes up and down every month with me and my plants anyway. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you very soon in the next one. Bye bye.